Imagine flying into the sky, confident, skilled, a master of the air, only to realize that no matter how many enemies you bring down, the battle never ends. Every bomber you shoot down is replaced by two more the next day. This is the day German pilots discovered that skill, bravery, and even terror in the skies couldn't outmatch the relentless force of American industry. The Reich skies were about to become a battlefield they could never truly win. By 1943, the air war over Europe had reached a terrifying crescendo. Luftwaffe aces, men who had been celebrated as gods of the sky, whose skill had won countless duels, began noticing a pattern that sent shivers down even the most seasoned spines. For every bomber they downed, for every B-17 or B-24 that fell in flames, it seemed that the sky the next morning was just as crowded, or more so. The sheer volume of American aircraft emerging from factories, hangars, and airfields was staggering. It wasn't just planes. It was a manifestation of an industrial juggernaut that the Germans had underestimated. These pilots, accustomed to holding the heavens, now faced a chilling truth. No matter how sharp their aim, no matter how precise their maneuvers, the numbers didn't lie. The Allies' factories, humming, massive, relentless, were producing planes faster than they could destroy them. American sheet metal engines and instruments flowed like a river across the country, assembled by tens of thousands of workers who never saw combat, yet were shaping the war in every strike. In the skies above Germany, aces who once ruled with pride now felt a creeping despair. And the bomber crews themselves were relentless. The B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators were engineered not just for endurance, but for resilience. With gunners in every turret and armor shielding vital components, they absorbed punishment that would have sent other aircraft plummeting to the ground. They didn't flee, they pressed on, forming massive formations that turned the air into a moving fortress. From the perspective of a Luftwaffe pilot, each wave was more than a tactical challenge, it was a psychological onslaught. You could kill the crew, puncture the wings, but the next formation would arrive without hesitation. German pilots began to whisper among themselves, a mix of fear and disbelief coloring their voices. The war in the air was no longer a duel of skill, speed, and bravery. It had transformed into a contest against a force far larger than any individual, against the industrial heartbeat of a nation. And that heartbeat, powered by sweat, ingenuity, and relentless productivity, was unstoppable. Every sortie into the sky became not just a mission, but a confrontation with an invisible enemy that existed not on the airfield or in the clouds, but in the factories, the assembly lines, and the minds of those who built the machines of war. The Reich, we our finest, the pilots whose names had once sent terror across the Atlantic and the English Channel, now faced a truth harsher than any anti-aircraft barrage. Skill alone could no longer win the sky. And as the American production lines hummed, each roar of an engine from a new bomber became a reminder that Germany was fighting a war it could not match in scale. The pilots were brave, precise, even legendary, but industrial might, relentless, untiring, and merciless, was about to redefine the rules of air combat forever. By mid-1943, the German Luftwaffe was stretched to its breaking point. Elite units, once feared and respected across Europe, were now being pulled from one front to another, their pilots exhausted, their planes worn thin by constant combat. The skies above Germany had become a grim calculus. How many enemy bombers could a squadron realistically intercept before they themselves were overwhelmed? Each mission carried the weight of an entire air strategy, and every loss was magnified not just in numbers, but in morale. The Americans, meanwhile, had perfected the concept of massed air power. Factories from coast to coast churned out aircraft at a pace that seemed almost impossible to counter. A lost B-17 one day was replaced by two more tomorrow, A squadron decimated in the skies returned reinforced and stronger the next. It was a wave of steel and fire that no matter how skilled a pilot, no matter how daring a maneuver, could never fully halt. The scale of production was a weapon in itself, invisible, inexhaustible, and indifferent to any threat posed by individual heroics. On the front lines, Luftwaffe pilots felt the psychological weight of this industrial avalanche. They had trained to expect skill, to respect strategy, and to fear innovation. But this was something different. For the first time, they were forced to confront an enemy that was to human in the traditional sense. It was an entire nation ES output, coordinated and unyielding. Formations of fortresses would come day after day, their gunners trained, their engines strong, and their resolve unwavering. Every engagement became not just a battle in the air, but a test of endurance against a machine far larger than any single squadron. German commanders realized that tactics alone could no longer dictate outcomes. No matter how they reorganized, no matter how they concentrated fighter groups or honed interception strategies, the tide of American industry was simply too great. Even a perfect ambush, even the downing of 20 or 30 bombers in a single mission, could not stem the flow. It was a battle against the unseen. Production lines, raw materials, engineers, and assembly workers, the unseen army fueling the skybound storm. As bomber losses mounted, so did frustration and despair. Pilots who once prided themselves on skill and instinct began questioning the value of their efforts. The psychological pressure was immense. Every mission risked not only their lives, but the bitter realization that no single act of bravery could alter the strategic reality. The Luftwaffe aces, who had once dominated European skies, now found themselves humbled, outmatched not by courage or tactics, but by relentless industrial power. And with each passing day, the war tilted further in favor of those whose factories never slept, whose assembly lines were as lethal as any fighter plane whose determination to produce was as precise and unstoppable as any aerial tactic. The skies over Germany became a living nightmare. Radar stations screamed warnings, flak batteries erupted in blinding bursts, and the Luftwaffe scrambled to meet waves of bombers that seemed endless. Pilots spoke in hushed tones of the factory storm, a ceaseless tide of B-17s and later B-24s, each formation larger, more disciplined, and harder to break than the last. It was no longer a contest of skill alone, it was attrition. Writ large, a grinding, demoralizing struggle where numbers, production, and relentless pressure held all the cards. The German air aces, once legends of the Reich, began to feel the weight of inevitability. They had flown hundreds of sorties, maneuvered through the tightest defensive formations, and survived dogfights that would have broken ordinary men. Yet every time they returned to their airfields, they saw new squadrons taking off, fully fueled, armed, and ready to strike again. It was as if the sky itself had become a conveyor belt for destruction, one that no amount of courage could halt. The men who had once been feared across Europe were now chasing ghosts produced by assembly lines. Even innovations in tactics and technology could barely keep pace with the relentless American output. Jet fighters and advanced anti-bomber strategies were developed, but their deployment lagged, and production could not match the sheer scale of the Allied onslaught. Every tactical success was fleeting, every downed bomber was replaced, often doubled by the next day. The Luftwaffe faced a cruel arithmetic. No matter how skilled or brave the pilot, the industrial tide was an unstoppable multiplier. The human cost was staggering. Veteran pilots burned out. Inexperienced replacements were sent into near-impossible missions, and the attrition of training quality compounded the losses. Yet, above all, the psychological impact was profound. Pilots began to understand a terrifying truth. The war was no longer just about victories in the air, but about survival against an adversary whose strength lay not in individual heroics, but in a system so vast and efficient it could render individual efforts almost irrelevant. For the German leadership, the reality was even grimmer. Strategic bombing was eroding infrastructure, production, and morale faster than the Luftwaffe could respond. Cities were burning, railways were disrupted, and factories that produced tanks, planes, and ammunition were increasingly targeted and destroyed. The very industrial backbone that supported the Luftwaffe was crumbling, further accelerating the imbalance. A chilling conclusion began to crystallize. The might of German pilots, no matter how legendary, could not match the relentless output of American industry. They were fighting a war against machines that never slept, planes that kept coming, and a nation that had mastered the art of infinite replacement. By 1944, the reality was undeniable. The Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Pilots who once struck fear into the hearts of Allied airmen were now struggling to hold back a tide that no skill or courage could stem. Airfields were stripped bare, aircraft were fewer, and the training of replacements had been accelerated to the point where inexperienced teenagers were thrown into the air with little hope of survival. Every sortie became a gamble, every dogfight a desperate attempt to delay the inevitable. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, American factories never paused. Detroit's assembly lines, the heart of the arsenal of democracy, churned out planes at a staggering pace. Entire fleets of bombers rolled off production lines, crews were trained with astonishing efficiency, and logistical networks ensured that men and machines reached the front in perfect synchronization. The skies over Europe were no longer a stage for duels between aces. They had become a battlefield of industrial might, where quantity, discipline, and relentless pressure overshadowed individual skill. German aces faced an impossible choice. They could fight bravely, taking down bombers in staggering numbers during individual missions, yet each victory felt hollow. For every bomber destroyed, more came, faster, better armed, and carrying even more destructive payloads. The Reich's infrastructure was being eroded from above. Oil depots, railways, and factories struck relentlessly. Even the heroics of the most skilled pilots could not counter the unyielding wave of American production. The war in the air had become a grim arithmetic of attrition, and the sums did not favor Germany. And so, the lesson was painfully clear. No matter how valiant, no matter how skilled, the Luftwaffe could not outfly American industry. Courage met machinery, skill met relentless production, and the skies themselves bore witness to the slow but unstoppable collapse of German air power. What began as a war of man versus man had become a war of man versus machine. And in this contest, the factories had already won. History remembers the courage of those German pilots, their feats, their losses, their desperation. But it also tells a broader story. The true power that changed the course of World War II was not only bombs or bullets, but the hum of assembly lines, the efficiency of mass production, and the unyielding will of a nation to sustain the fight. The Luftwaffe's greatest adversary was not the men in the sky, but the unstoppable force of American industry, a storm that no pilot could evade, no maneuver could escape, and no skill could overcome. If this story captivated you, hit like, subscribe to World War Ashes for more intense historical deep dives, and comment below with the moment in history that left you most in awe. Every story, every strategy, and every battle shaped the world, and we'll uncover them all, one unforgettable story at a time.